There we go. So my fly for today is called a Grizzly King. And the story behind that, and here it is, that's the Grizzly King. The story behind that is the Grizzly King was a fly that, as I was a kid growing up in doing summer trips to the Okanagan, we used to fish the high mountain lakes in behind Kelowna and Vernon. And the evening rise, that was the flies that were effective, was a dry fly called the Grizzly King. So I looked it up a little bit, and it originated as a wet fly. And it was a professor at the university in Glasgow that invented the fly. But the first one he invented was called the Professor. And that's the Professor there. It's a traditional English wet fly. It's a floss body with a silver or gold rib, a little bit of red tail, and mallard or teal as a wing, and a little bit of hackle. Fairly simple fly to tie, very straightforward. And so that's the Professor. And here's the Grizzly King, which is basically the same construction. It's got a floss body, gold tinsel, red mallard tail, or sorry, red duckquill tail, and then teal or mallard is the wing, and then a grizzly hackle underneath. But the ones that we used when we were fishing the interior lakes was the dry fly version. There's the dry fly version. So we'll start with the wet.
You're all blurry again, Dave.
Hmm?
And it's out of focus again.
Yeah, well, let me just double check how. Clean off the camera. That might be part of it. And I will give you where are we here? Let's just, okay. I just need to get it sorted out here. So is that, we'll get a hook in here. So the hook I'm using is a Mustad long curved hook. It's a 3X long. It's curved. It's a mild steel hook, so you have to take the barb off and it doesn't break. I'll stick that in the vise. And I'm going to leave a fair bit of the bend exposed because part of this pattern has a tag on it that is silver. So we'll start the thread. It's just black thread. I'm using 6/0. We'll start that at the front of the hook. Clean it off. And then I'm going to leave the thread just, I need to loosen that vise just a hair. Should have done that before. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to leave about 4 eye widths back. I don't want to tie anything much further forward than that until I'm doing the body. So the first thing that I do is I'm going to take tinsel, and this is the standard Mylar tinsel that is gold on one side and silver on the other. Now this guy is supposed to have a silver tag with a gold tinsel oval on the body. So what I'm going to do with this is the tag is going to be silver. So I'm going to tie it on with the gold side out. And I'm going to tie it right behind the eye. Come on. Got a little kink in the, get along here.
So you tie kinky flies.
Yeah, that's because the Mylar kinks up when it was put in the spool. So I'm going to wrap this down the shank. right back to where the barb on the hook was. That's just slightly around on this curved hook, just slightly around the bend. Then I'm gonna open spiral 2 or 3 wraps to get my thread forward out of the way. And from here, I'm going to wrap a few turns down the shank from the tie-in point. And this is going to end up backwards. And I'm going to wrap touching turns down 3 or 4 wraps. And forward. And then I'm going to wrap back up over top of it to make this shiny butt. When I get there, I'm going to unwrap my thread back. And I'm going to take this on top and wrap over top. I'm just going to wrap in front of it to push that tinsel towards the back of it. So it's out of the way. Now, when I wrap over the body, depending on which side comes up, I'll either wrap the same way or the other way to get the different color on the body. Now, the next thing that I need is floss. And I was saying to Florin earlier that I went to see if I could find some floss at Robinson's, but what I ended up finding was this olive stuff. They didn't have any real green floss. So I have my old green acetate floss that I've had for decades. And I'm going to, that's the ideal floss to use, is this emerald green. And it's a 4-strand floss. A lot of the stuff now is single strand. So I'm going to just trim off some of that. I'm going to set that aside because I need the tail first. The brain's not working this morning. So the tail is this red duck quill. And I'm going to cut a little segment that's about half of the gap. And pull it off the quill. You see it's got a nice little, the quill has a nice little curve to it. So I'm going to tie it so that that quill curves up. And the length of the tail is probably, you want it gap length past the end of the hook. So it's probably about shank length from where I'm going to tie it in. And the trick here is to make this sit on top of the hook. So I'm going to place it on top of the hook with my right hand. Then I'm going to pinch it there with my left hand. Now, well, the trick with tying quills is don't just tie right over top. You use a pinch wrap, you bring the thread up on the, pinch your fingers together, bring the thread up and slide it in between the 2 fingers. Pull down the other side in between the 2 fingers, but don't pull straight down. Don't tighten it that way. Bring the thread back up on the near side and tighten by pulling up. And then you do that again. Pinch down, thread down between the pinched fingers, up the near side, and pull up. And what that does is that ensures that that quill material is going to sit on top of the hook. And it's not going to want to wrap around. And then I'm going to just wrap the butts down solid. So now I've got my nice little red quill sticking out the back. Points up a little bit. I'm going to take my floss. There we go. Even up the ends. And the thread is up now back at that point that's about 4 eye widths behind. I'm going to lay the floss down there and tie it down. I'm going to leave my thread there. Now I'm going to wrap the body by wrapping back towards the back. And this 4-strand floss, if you're careful with it, it will spread out. You can see it kind of spreading out here. And so that almost the individual segments are showing, the individual threads. Now, every so often, as you wrap this, it will tend to twist up. So you got to keep an eye on it to make sure that you're not ending up with all those strands bunched together. So every once in a while, you might have to counter wrap, twist that thread to make it go flat like that. And then I'm going to go back up to where the thread is at the front. It only takes 3 or 4 wraps when it's spread out like that. And I'm going to go back once more. And I'm trying to make these spread out threads touch each other to make a nice smooth body. And then I'm going to do the same thing going forward. So now you see I've got a bit of a tapered body there. I didn't go all the way to the back. And it's kind of a cigar shape to the body. Do that, and I'm going to tie over top. 3. And then tie in front. And trim the floss off. I'm going to take my hackle pliers. I'm going to grab this tinsel right at the tip end. And I'm going to come around, and depending on which direction, I'm going to use the other pliers. Depending on which direction I wrap this, it's going to be gold, silver, or gold. And I just have to do a little experiment to see which way it is. So this time, if I wrap it over top, going the same way as I did the other, it's actually the silver is going to be out. So I don't want the silver, I want the gold. So I'll wrap it the other direction. And there we go. So by picking the direction I'm wrapping, I'm going to get that with the correct color facing out. Make sure it doesn't twist on me. And I only need 3 or 4 wraps just to give a little segmentation. I'm going to wrap that down. Now, one of the things I discovered in doing these is because this floss is fairly slippery, there's a tendency for it to unravel a little bit on you. And the wraps won't be nice and even because it will, the tinsel will slide it back and forth on the body. So at this point, I'm just going to take a little bit of glue and I'm just going to touch it on the top. And what that'll do is that will, when it sets up, it will hold those tinsel wraps in place so they don't spiral and loose on you. Got a few bits of floss. One of the problems with this old acetate floss is it will fray, and you kind of have to watch it that it doesn't get away from you. Okay. So the next thing we need is we need to build a little bit of a spot up here on the front of the hook where I'm going to tie the hackle. So I'm going to tie about an eye width of black thread in front of the body that's more or less flat. And I'm going to put my thread near the back of that. Now the hackle is basically a fairly soft hackle. It's a, I guess you could call it like schlappen, or it's a hen type hackle. And I only want the barbules to be about shank length at the most. So I'm going to pick that off. I'm going to stroke the feather backwards to the point where I find the proper length of hackle, which is about there. And I'm going to strip all of the barbules off the stem towards the butt so that all I've got is the proper length barbules there. And then I'm going to say, well, I want about 3 wraps of stem around for these. I don't want a whole lot of hackle. So I'm going to stroke back the part of the feather that I want that is about, I think, shank length of stem. And I'm going to stroke the tip forward so I end up with that little V. And with the intensely colored side of the feather facing me, I'm going to lay that down where that V is, right where the thread is. And I'm going to go 2 or 3 good solid wraps with thread in there. And then I'm going to come in front, pull up the tip, wrap in front, and I'm going to keep holding on to that. I'm going to get in there with my scissors and just gently, with the edge of the blade, snip that out, tie it down. And then I'm going to do the usual folded hackle technique. I'm going to use my thumb and forefinger slightly wet and fold the hackle back. Make sure it's going out past the thread here. That's one of the problems with this these fine hackles is you pull on that stem too hard and it will break. 2, and it looks like 2.5 wraps will be enough. I'm going to tie off the stem. Trim it out. Now, the trick here is to get this stuff to go back and down. So I'm going to wet my fingertips and I'm going to stroke all these fibers back. I'm going to wrap over top of them, in front of them a bit, and over top of them a bit to force the whole hackle backwards. And then I'm going to use my finger to divide it at the top and push them down, and then wrap over them really solid. And what that does is that forces all of the hackle, pretty much all of the hackle, off the top of the hook, so it's all facing down. When I got that there, I'm going to wrap a bit of a tapered thread ramp at the front. And then I'm going to put my thread halfway up that ramp. So you see there's a little taper in thread there. What that taper is going to do is that's going to force the wing up when I put the wing on. The wing is teal flank. It's, I pick a feather that's got a fair bit of length to it, where the barbules are fairly long, because I need to be able to adjust the length of this wing. I'm going to strip the bottom half of this off so I can work just with the barbules. And I'm going to take a nice chunk of this. I'm going to take a good bit of that mallard flank that is probably about double gap, maybe a little more than double gap. I'm going to stroke them so that it stays together a little bit straight out from the side. Then I'm going to pinch it hard with my thumb and forefinger, and I'm going to separate that stuff from the stem. Now I want, see how I got the little curlicues here? I don't want to cut it off, because if I cut it off, all these fibers will come separated. if I leave the little curlicues there and grab them with my right hand, it's going to hold that feather together. I'm going to lay it on top of my finger, and I'm going to fold it down over my finger in half. See, that makes that nice flat folded in half bit. And I haven't cut the tips off. So now I can measure this. I want the wing to be slightly short of where the tail is. Again, I'm going to use this pinch wrap. I'm going to hold it with my right, then pinch with my left thumb and forefinger, up in between them, down the far side, up in between them, and pull up. Down the far side, up in between, and pull up. And there he is. Tie him in, and hold it up, make sure it stays up there. Gonna wrap once in front, and then I'm gonna trim these off nice and short. Make sure these are clear of the eye, wrap down. And I'm gonna make a good sized thread head on this. Because these old fashioned flies tend to have a nice, big, shiny thread head. And then I'm gonna whip finish. I don't need to do two because I am gonna glue this guy. Get in here with the edge of my scissors and just up against the thread to cut it off. I'm gonna take my Sally Hansen's Hard as Nails. Make sure that's sitting on top. And I'm gonna come in here with my glue and I'm gonna dab it all around. So I end up with a reasonable amount of glue on that thread head. And then because that will tend to fill up the eye, I take the tip of that hackle that I just used, and I pull some barbules off the end to leave the stem sticking out. And then I'm going to stick the stem down into the eye of the hook. And then I'm going to pull that whole feather through. And what that does is that clears all of the glue out of the eye. So there you go. That's the Grizzly King wet fly version.
That's a nice looking fly, Dave, too.
Yeah, it turned out quite nice. The trick is to get that feather folded in half nicely. It's not, I've done a few of them where they didn't do so well and I had to do it all over again.
Yeah, you know what I sometimes do with the, and for me it seems to work better. I was impressed the way you managed to fold that feather there. I actually trim those hooky bits at the when you, instead of stripping it off, I actually cut it, and then if I cut it, I find it folds a little bit neater.
I found that if I cut the little curly bits off the end, what happens is as soon as you cut them off, they have a tendency to not stay married together. Now, maybe that's because I'm using not using mallard, I'm using teal. And because they don't stay married together, it's a little hard to get that flat appearance to the wing.
Right.
And so I keep them intact and do the fold, and that seems to work. And the other trick is getting the hackle out of the way by pulling it down. And then it will sit on that thread ramp and have the right angle. So we're going to do the dry. And it's the same color combination, pretty much the same materials, with a little bit of variation. So I'm going to take that out of there. And then I'm going to take my box of hooks, and out of there, I'm going to pick a size 12. And this is just a mustad, standard mustad dry fly hook. Once again, pre-do the barb so that you don't tie a fly and then ruin the hook when you bend the barb down. Well, I don't know if I showed you guys the last time. My wife had this gizmo for doing little scratchings and etchings and cleaning up edges on stained glass material when she was doing stained glass. So she had this miniature Dremel. There it is. And that can be used to grind the barbs off. So she lost it. It's now mine. She hasn't done stained glass for a while. So once again, black 8/0 thread. Another thing I discovered in getting together, that I have a whole bunch of spools that are almost got no thread on them anymore. So I'm using remnants of black 8/0 thread on the spools. Same rig, I'm going to tie it in at the front, just to close up that little gap behind the eye so that your tippet doesn't slip in there if you're using a lightweight tippet and get jammed in there. Now this time, I'm less worried about the tag. I'm not going to do a tag on this. So I am going to dress the hook right down to the bend. I'm going to take it right to where the barb of the hook used to be. Now for the tail, I'm using a package of bright red strung saddle. And I'm going to pull off of this guy. I'm going to pull off half a dozen, maybe a little more strands off the shank of that. And that's probably not enough. I want a little bushier. Now, by using the saddle, these are strong enough fibers that they're going to hold the fly up. Measure shank length, lay that right down over the thread. And I'm just going to do a loose wrap over top to seat it in place. And I'm going to wrap forward again till I'm probably 2 to 3 eye widths behind the eye. I'm going to trim out that excess, tie it down. And at that point, 2 or 3 eye widths behind, I'm going to once again attach my tinsel. Now this time I need to be a little more conscious of how I'm tying this on, because I want a gold body. So I want to tie it so that the gold is facing in. So I'm going to set this down on the hook.
Yeah, but I showed you, you don't remember. That's the thing.
There we go. Now I've got the gold side facing into the hook, the silver facing out. And I'm doing this on the near side of the hook. And I'm going to wrap over that all the way back to the tail, where the tail is attached. Bring my thread forward, trying to keep that shank nice and smooth where I'm winding the thread forward. Now this time, I'm not going to use all 4 strands of the floss. I'm going to use 2 because I don't want a big fat body here. I only want a skinny, relatively skinny body. It's a dry fly, so I don't want to overdress the body. I'm going to take 2 strands, capture the other ones. And again, I'm going to tie these in at the front. I'm not going to bother trimming them. I'm just going to wrap over and then I'm going to slide them back on the first wrap. And once again with this thing, I'm going to start at the front and I'm going to wrap towards the back. And you can see again, this floss has a tendency to spread out. Because I'm only using 2 strands, it's going to be a nice skinny little body. And I only need to go back and forth once. You don't want to put too much material on these because then they won't float properly. Tie that down and then tie in front and trim the excess. Doesn't take much floss to do that. Now again, because this is tied on the right way, I can wrap this over the same direction and that tinsel will have turned over. So now it's going to be gold side out. Four or 5 wraps. Come up, tie that off. And wrap in front. I should have tightened up my bobbin a bit. Trim that off nice and tight. Now for the hackle on this guy, I'm going to use an actual neck hackle. And then, but for the wing, it's the same material. It's this mallard flank. And what I'm going to do with the mallard flank is I'm going to pull off again, not as much as I did for the wing, probably just a hair more than gap. I want a fair number of fibers. And I'm going to grab them by the tip and pull them straight out. I don't care if they spread out this time. So this is going to be the wing, and it's going to be a fairly skinny bunched up wing. And I'm going to turn it around so that the tips are facing forward. And I'm going to measure from the eye of the hook to the bend. I'm going to set that right down on top of my thread. And I'm going to tie it in like that. 1, 2, 3. Pull this up, wrap behind, and trim it off. Then what I'm going to do is pull these fibers up and back, and I'm going to wrap in front of them, build a little dam of thread in front of them so that they point straight up. So now they're sticking straight up. Bring my thread in behind there. And this is where I'm going to put my hackle. So I need to pick a hackle off the neck, and I want the barbules to be roughly shank length. And the way to do this is to take the feather and wrap it around the hook, and you can see where it sticks out So I want about gap in a bit. That's not quite long enough. I'm going to pick one that's maybe a little longer. Yep, that'll do it. I'm going to pull that off the neck. And where I'm going to tie it in, I'm going to, again, do a quick measure on the hook to see where those, how long those barbules are. And that's about where I want them, about that length. So from there on, I'm going to see how rapidly that tapers here. I'm going to start and strip these guys off to expose the stem on both sides. So those ones are too long, but the ones from here are going to be good. Then I'm going to trim butt section off. Now with this guy, I'm going to tie this in so that the intensely colored part of the feather is facing away from me. I'm going to hold that at 45. My thread's in behind the wing. Hold that at a 45-degree angle and wrap over the stem. And wrap in front of the wing to tie the stem down. And it just so happened I had that stem short enough that I managed to not have to trim it off. I'm going to take my hackle pliers. Now another trick with this to get these to stand out right is I'm going to take this hackle and I'm going to pull it forward slightly towards the eye of the hook. That puts a little kink in the stem of the hackle. So now when I start to wrap, it's going to stand everything out at right angles to the hook. And I'm going to wrap 3 or 4 wraps in behind the wing. Maybe one more. I want a more heavily hackle fly here. And then I'm going to pull back and I'm going to wrap a couple of wraps in front of the wing, making sure that it helps stand that wing up. 2 wraps is good. And I'm going to come up and wiggle my thread through there over the hackle stem a couple or 3 times. Pull the stem back and wrap in front a couple of times. And again, I'm going to get in here with my scissors and not try and snip it out, but try to lay the blade up against the hackle stem and pull it against the blade. And that'll avoid cutting your thread when you're doing that. I'm going to slide my fingers over and go a couple of wraps in front just to make sure things secure. And then I'm going to do my whip finish right behind the eye of the hook. And again, the edge of the scissors up against the thread. We'll cut it off. And then my glue, just again, a touch of glue on. I just don't need a lot of glue on this, just a touch of glue on it, just to cinch the threads up. And once again, with the tip of the hackle that I cut off, I'm going to expose the little bit of stem and stick that through the eye of the hook. If I can shoot them tweak, there we go. And draw it through to get rid of the excess glue. And there you go.
Hi.
There's the dry fly version of the Grizzly King.
That was a really useful little tip on the getting the little bend in the, the hackle, because the number of times that I've started to wind hackle around and then got the thing lying flat and just want to scream.
Yeah, or yeah, it just goes kinky. It goes off in odd directions. And So that little bit of bend, and if you're tying parachutes particularly, it's that giving that little bend really makes the parachute, that first wrap, go flat. And I think Florin can probably show you how that works. There we go. So Florin, it's up to you now.
Okay, maybe I should unmute myself. And
you which? You muted yourself.
I muted well, while you were tying there, I didn't want to, okay, so there we are. All right. So now you should see my vise. And what I'm going to tie is something that looks like this, which I hope you can see. This is a size 20 clink hammer hook. And as I said earlier, it's, you know, if you ever wanted to tie on size 20 hooks, this is the one to do, because it's not really a size 20 hook. It's much bigger. Okay, so what I was trying to do a little bit beforehand was to do a little bit of preparation to just kind of emphasize the fact that this fly is a bit of a hybrid. So as you can see, if you look here, this is just the tail end, and it's the biggest challenge with these clink hammer hooks, and you'll see me doing a lot of this, and this is where the Regal vise is really handy, is because of this humongous curve in the hook, and because you're trying to use most of the hook, you're going to have odd angles here, right? So the wing and the parachute are tied up here in the front, and then the back end of it is basically just a pheasant tail nymph, okay? So you can think of you're tying a pheasant tail nymph, and then you're trying to tie in front of the pheasant tail nymph, you're tying a parachute dry fly. And this is how I'm going to tie this thing, okay? But what I'm doing in order to do more flies at the same time in a batch, I'm going to first tie myself all these abdomens and the tails in, and then I'm going to do the parachute separately. But now for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to do this with starting with a bare hook. Okay, so if I put a hook in the vise like this, I'm going to struggle with the tail big time. So what I do to start with is I just put in the hook at an angle that's going to position the back end of the fly in a very convenient manner. Okay, so I take some 8/0 thread and start obviously somewhere deep down into the back bend of this hook. Okay, so bring myself to the point where I want to attach the tail. Now for the tail, I'm going to use again similar material to last time, same thing. This is a golden pheasant. And I'm going to separate 4, maximum 5 fibers off the side. I hope I didn't get more than that. The thing is that this pheasant is very, very fragile. So if I get more, it'll probably just break off. It won't matter much. Okay. So again, I don't want too much length here, just going, you know, the length of the tail equal to the gap of the hook would give you a bit too long of a tail. So I'm going to try to make it a little shorter than that. Okay, so one wrap and another just very light wrap. Obviously this is way too long, but I didn't tighten up too much. So I can just go easy now and pull gently on the front and shorten this tail a little bit. You can see it's possible to do this before you tighten it too much. Okay. So this looks satisfactory. So now I'm going to do another wrap here to tighten it properly. And then I'm going to move the pheasant fibers towards my side. Just do a couple of wraps on top. So now it's all pointing backwards. See, I've already lost a fiber as promised. The next thing, and this is very important, otherwise this pheasant tail is not going to even last a couple of casts. Just take very fine copper wire. This is going to be the rib over the abdomen, and attach it where you attached the pheasant tail. Okay, and then move your thread forward to about where the abdomen is going to end. I'm going to let the wire hang here on the side, and I'm going to remove the hook from the vise and actually reposition it at a more convenient angle for dealing with the pheasant tail. Now, the thing is, it's still at an awkward angle. So at this point, whoops, at this point, I'm going to just put in a half hitch so that my thread doesn't go all loose. Okay, so now I'm going to take the pheasant. I'm going to start wrapping the pheasant to build the abdomen of the fly. And it's already breaking up. It just has to hold together until you come with the rib over the top of it, because then you can always secure it in place. Okay. It's not too bad. I didn't break off too many fibers in this case. As you get closer to the butts, it gets stronger, but then it's also less useful. Okay. Let me rewind the thread. So you secure this. And trim. Okay. At this point, I'm going to bring the wire, and I'm going to wrap the wire in the opposite direction I did the wrapping of the pheasant. And this way I get two things. The wire is going to stand up a little bit more because it's going to sit on top rather than bury itself in between the bits of pheasant tail, and also is going to give me a stronger reinforcement of those fibers. Okay, so a couple of wraps of thread over the wire, and then that is all secured. Okay, now I'm going to reposition. Going to be doing this several times. It's going to happen all the way until I'm done. Okay, so now I have the abdomen in place, and I need a wing for this fly. Now for the wing, I have some gray, kind of dun colored yarn. And to be honest, I'm not sure whether this is Antron or poly yarn or Xylon or whatever it is. It's the right color. It's got a bit of sparkle in it, so it's still going to be quite visible on the water. And I'm going to cut myself a piece that's just a little bit longer than what I'm going to need for the wing. There you go. And I'm going to tie this facing forward like this. Okay, and the reason I tie it longer than what I need is because it's going to be easier to handle if I have that little bit of extra length. If you tie the wing already to the correct size of the bat, then it can be quite challenging to do everything else. If I do this, okay. So cover these little stubby ends. This is where the thorax is going to be, and then lift the wing up. as well, with a few tight wraps right in front of it. Okay. Now this is going to be a parachute. So I'm going to do one more thing, which is post this wing right after tying it in. You could post it later, but it's easier if you do it now because you have a good starting point at the base. If it doesn't work very well, just use your fingers to hold it a little bit and do a few posting wraps. Okay. Go back down to the base. Let the thread hang for a moment while you get your hackle. So I have this is a done saddle hackle, and I have it in my bag that's labeled size 18. Okay. Now, officially, this is a size 20 hook, but as I said, it's rather a gigantic hook. So I go one size up on hackle. And even if you were tying on a regular size hook, a parachute hackle is a good idea to oversize a little bit. So if you happen to have only larger hackle, and if you want to tie the smaller flies, then just tie parachutes and your oversized hackle is going to work just fine. Okay, to secure the hackle, I'm going to, as usual, just trim a little bit the first fibers on the first, whatever, 1/8 of an inch or so on the hackle stem. And now this hackle is a little bit hard to see, but there's a darker, somewhat shinier side, and there is the duller side. And what I want to do is I want to attach this hackle along, ultimately I want it along the post, along the wing, and I want it with the shiny side facing me. So the shiny side of the hackle has to be towards the outside of the wing and the dull side facing the wing. So this is how I'm going to attach it here at the thorax. And I'm attaching it first on the hook, and then I'm going to move it into a vertical position. And this is a little bit harder to show on camera, but what I'm doing is I'm bending this hackle so it's sitting upright here, and I'm going to do a couple of wraps over the wing and the hackle at the same time, which is now going to secure the hackle along the wing. It's going to get in the way a little bit, and if you use a long saddle, this is going to be quite a mess at this point. You just kind of have to make sure that your saddle hackle doesn't get tangled up in the thread. Okay, we're almost done. We just need a little bit of dubbing. And this is the same superfine dubbing that I've used last time I showed doing dry flies. I don't know if this is visible here. It's a PMD color. If you want a little bit darker, you can add a pinch of something else to make it a little darker. And really, you can barely see the amount of dubbing that I took, just a tiny, tiny, tiny amount. Okay. And it might still be a little too much. We'll see. Once you put it on the thread, you can actually see how much dubbing there really is. Okay, and what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to begin dubbing this thorax from the head of the fly. So I go right behind the eye with a couple of wraps, and then I go backward and just wiggle my thread so I don't catch in any things that I don't want to catch in. Then I go back to where I stopped with the abdomen. So here's my thorax. Still have just enough dubbing here. I can return my thread to the base of the wing. Okay, I don't want to catch any wing fibers if I can. Okay. All right, I think I moved something and it went out of focus. Okay. So now what I have is I have the thorax built up. And for convenience, I'm going to move this hook in the vise one last time. I'm going to move it to an angle where wrapping the hackle is going to be as easy as possible. And what I'm going to do, so just make sure I don't have too much fuzz here, just maybe one more turn at the base of the wing, okay? And now this hackle, as Dave said, probably depending on how thick the stem of your hackle is, really. Some hackles have really fine stems and they're really easy to wrap. This one is a little bit stiffer. So if it's a little stiffer, just give it a little kink here with your fingernail and then start wrapping downwards. So I'm wrapping from my right to the left or from the top of the wing towards the base, okay? And then try to wrap this so that you don't catch too many fibers. So pulling the hackle down, as it were, or towards the vise, and then over the hook shank, and then down again. And then just keep wiggling it like this. It's going to keep most of the fibers on the right side. Okay, and then secure when you have done 2 or 3 complete turns of hackle, and you got a nice hackle on this fly. And slide the blade of the scissor and just pull on the hackle, and that's going to cut it off. Okay, now I notice I have a few trapped fibers, and I'm going to deal with those at the very end. Okay, so now I'm just going to get my whip finisher, and I'm going to put in a whip finish here right at the base of the wing. And the second one, because I'm not going to use any glue whatsoever. And then again, slide the scissor blades and trim. Okay, now I have to deal with the offending fibers, which you can see very easily on camera here. So I have some fibers that have gotten caught in there and are offending because they're pointing downwards. Okay, I have also a couple of fibers here that are just over the eye of the hook and a bit in the way. And I have to just be careful I'm not cutting things that I want to keep. Okay. And then you can look at this and decide whether this is a big enough wing for you or you want it even shorter. Sometimes, you know, you can do a few final bits of trimming, okay? And that is your fly. Okay, so it's a parachute hackle combined with a little pheasant tail nymph. Okay, and then I was trying to work on tying these on smaller sizes, and I was experimenting with these buzzer hooks. And here is a size 18 buzzer hook, which you can then compare with a fly that I just tied here. And you can see in terms of shank length, they're about identical. So if I want to go to something smaller than what I just tied. I have these buzzer hooks. Fortunately, they do come in smaller sizes. The Daiichi I couldn't find smaller than size 20. So if I want a smaller size, I'm going to experiment with this hook. The other thing with this buzzer hook that's very noticeable, it's also a lot heavier wire. So I hope that should still float, given that it's really small size. It probably will float.
Won't get straightened out by the big fish.
It won't be straightened out by the big fish. Yeah, people like Don Anderson have this problem. It doesn't usually happen to me. But yeah, should I hook into the big monster of the stream, then with this hook, I'll be fine. It's the leader I'd be more worried about than the hook, frankly, because if you use a fine enough leader that's called for in situations like that, probably straightening the hook is not going to be your biggest worry. That's the
thanks to both of you, but I have to go. So thanks again. Have a good weekend, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Florin. That was really cool. I'm looking forward to trying that.
Yeah, you've got your Klinghammer hooks?
I do. I think I have all the kit for that.
Okay, what size do you have?
Oh, that's a good question.
So if you want to prep yourself with some video, look up Hans van Klinken on the net and look at him tie the Klinkhammer Special. Hans is the guy who invented the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually got to meet him in Edmonton once and watch him tie a slide. So it's worth looking at the video.
That's a good tip, Dave. Thank you. I have the Daiichi.
Have to leave.
Dave, you remember when the time when those flies came from China were worth 15 cents each, or if you bought a dozen, you got them for 10 cents?
Not happening now.
No. We used to buy them and then take some varnish and redo the heads because they didn't have any varnish on the heads. They did them with the least amount of material they